Well, politics and money, as old as that linkage is, it had seemed that the use of cash for access to power was something pretty much behind us. Not anymore. This week we were told that $20,000 can get you a fancy private session with the Premier of British Columbia. In Ontario, provincial cabinet ministers are sent out to hustle up secret donation targets, in some cases upwards of $500,000 each. It's all cash eventually destined for party coffers to fight future elections. And guess what? It's all legal. In some provinces, all parties do it. So what now? Andrew's in Toronto tonight, Chantel's in Montreal, and veteran Conservative strategist Tim Powers joins us this week from Ottawa. A lot of people have been writing about this, including Gary Mason, our friend from the Globe and Mail. This is how he concluded a piece yesterday. I just want you to see the last line here. Political power should not be for sale in this country. Right now, it is. Is that the way it is, Andrew?
Well, it's certainly political power and political influence. I mean, the money is used to fight elections, and we can have a whole discussion about the role and influence of union and corporate donations in funding parties. But the specific thing, of course, that's got people particularly exercised is you've got individual ministers, and indeed the Premier in some cases, meeting in private, in some cases in secret, certainly not advertised, taking large sums of money for their parties in exchange for private one-on-one conversations. Now, you know, nobody else gets to spend several $1,000s. Most people don't have that kind of money, but very few people are in a position even to offer that kind of money to get that kind of access. So yeah, you're giving privileged access, at the least, you're giving privileged access to people in return for large sums of money. That's the definition of buying influence.
Chantel?
It also makes a mockery of the writing of codes of interest for office holders, in the sense that if you're going to tell your ministers and your MPs that they need to raise X amount of money, you're basically asking them to legislate during the day and then beg for money at night to finance the party. Now, Quebec has just gone through, as you know, a long spell of inquiries. It's still ongoing tonight with a Quebec minister possibly on the way out again. But one of the core reasons why it got so bad at the provincial level was the condition put on ministers to raise X amount of dollars, which you can call it not criminal because it's legal in provinces like Ontario and BC, but it is still collusion when you are getting something. And are you just assuming that the people who are giving you money, or corporate people or union people, are doing it because they like you so much?
Okay, well, Tim,
Doesn't everybody, Peter, want to spend $20,000 to have a piece of rubber chicken? I thought that was natural.
I mean, we should clarify right out of the gate that federally the rules changed some time ago, actually. And in some provinces they're a little different. But you get the tone. You're hearing what Chantel and Andrew are saying. You've been on both sides of this, Tim, in the sense of where the rules have changed and where they have not. Is it as blatant as they're saying?
And I've been one of those blood-sucking leeches who calls people and asks for money. I've done fundraising in 5 different provinces. I would say this, it certainly is a ticket to a hearing aid and being heard by politicians. Does it actually manifest itself in terms of policy decisions changing? I wouldn't go that far. I haven't seen examples of that. But you know what I liken it to? It's a bit like the Cold War. It's a form of mutually assured destruction because you don't see other political parties in opposition in most of these provinces lobbying against it because they have to use that very system themselves to overcome the debt that they've been laden with when they're in opposition. So thus, the systems that you have are there because nobody wants to blow them up because it's not in their individual political interests.
We all agree the perception, at least, of access is there. The question is that access gaining these people anything? The people who are ponying up whether it's 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, are they getting something in return for that money?
Well, they're certainly getting access. They're certainly getting a hearing that is a superior access than to people who can't afford to spend that money or aren't in a position to offer it. So the access is real. There's no debate about that. Whether the conflict of interest is consummated or not is really not the issue. you should never, as a public office holder, and most of the conflict of interest codes are quite clear on this, you should never be putting the public in the position of having to wonder whether there's a quid pro quo. I should say, if you've got ministers raising money, in some cases here, from the industries they regulate, that is certainly setting up people to wonder what's going on here.
Any argument? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and if you are on the other side of this, and I saw in some of the stories that were published this week, corporate sources, saying they were tired of being shaken down for money by usually the party in power. If you are giving that money and you feel that way, it is because you think that it's the ticket of admission to at least be in the game if there is a contract to be had. It doesn't guarantee you that contract, but it's more than a perception. It's this feeling that if you don't do it, you're going to be on the outs with whoever is in power. And that's why most corporations, if you look at the donations when they are public, you'll find that they give to more than one party because they're hedging their bets. But they're not hedging their bets because they like the Conservatives and the Liberals equally. They're hedging their bets because either of those could be in power.
But they do, and this is common, is the governing party, whoever that party is, always raises more than the parties in opposition. Now, that is not coincidental.
All right, I'm watching Tim's face throughout this, and he looks like he's in pain.
Well, I'm glad I just don't have to make those calls anymore to raise money, and that's the good thing about the federal legislation. Andrew had it right in his column today. I'm not surprised to hear my brethren in the lobbying industry in Ontario saying they're happy there may be potential rules coming down, because it does put people who do some of the work that I do in a difficult circumstance, because there are expectations both from the political parties, and it's not just the Liberal Party in Ontario. There are political parties of all stripes who have these expectations that people who are in the government relations sector in jurisdictions where you have open fundraising like this do participate. I think Chantal used the phrase, she's right, it is in part a ticket for admission, and I just think nobody has come up with a better concept at the provincial level as to what to do. It's too simple to say, just take the federal model. You couldn't take the federal model to small jurisdictions like Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and expect the parties to raise the money that they are able to raise to compete politically.
Well, but they don't have to raise anything like the sums that they raise and spend today. This is the thing. We've never lived in an age in which it was cheaper and easier to communicate with large numbers of people, whether you're talking about websites or email blasts or viral videos or what have you, and yet we're spending more than we ever had. The only reason any of the parties need to spend, quote unquote, need to spend as much as they do is because the other ones do. If we ratcheted the whole thing down, if everybody spent less, frankly, we'd have a better democracy, because most of that money goes to what? Attack ads, push polls, robocalls, a lot of stuff that basically hurts democracy.
Okay, well, talk to me about that, where that money goes. We're talking an awful lot of money here. If they lose it, how is it going to impact the way parties operate? Is it, as Andrew says, it goes to those kind of things that a lot of people don't like in the first place, Tim?
Well, it's not Athens either. Andrew's right. It can be a bit cheaper to engage in politics, but it also can equally be more expensive because you have less people volunteering. You have more people relying on the technologies. The technologies aren't dirt cheap. You've run lots of programs at issue panels on robocalling. Yes, people don't like them, but they invest in them because they actually work. More advertising is done. Yes, it's easier to develop, but the buy is still not cheap. So it isn't that much less expensive. I'd argue, in fact, it's a bit more expensive in certain places to get involved in the political game.
But I think at the end of the day, if you change the rules, and we've seen this happen federally, you are creating a level playing field. And that is, I don't really care that they don't have enough money to buy more robocalls. Actually, I'm happy enough that they don't. But I think from the public, the voters' perspective, it just taints the political process to have elected officials act that way. And I would argue, without talking about dishonesty or illegal things, that it does change politics, that since the federal government is made up of parties that cannot get money from corporations or unions, it has made the NDP less beholden to unions, but it had also made parties in power. Nobody talks about a party being the party of Bay Street anymore. Why? Because Bay Street doesn't pay the piper and calls very little tunes. It's more interesting for a party in power to pay attention to small business there are more votes there and more contributions. So yes, I think it does change the substance of policies.
One thing I should add, Peter, I don't want to beat up on Tim here, but
I'm used to it, Andrew. Fire away.
it's not entirely surprising that the lobbyists got fed up because, of course, if from the lobbyist point of view, if anybody's going to get paid thousands of dollars to meet with ministers, it should be them. So in effect, the Ontario and BC Liberals are kind of cutting out the middleman here and saying, just send the checks directly to the party. Whether you are paying ministers thousands of dollars to meet with them or paying lobbyists, in either case, you are getting privileged access on the basis of who you know and or what amount of money you're willing to spend. And both of those things are, frankly, inimical to a proper functioning democracy.
All right, let's talk solutions here for a minute. What would be the number one change you'd make if you were able to enforce a change in this? Tim?
Well, I think it is restricting donations from corporations and unions. I agree that that is a good thing. I think, though, in certain jurisdictions, you would have to have a phased approach to that. I would also like to see maybe the limits on individual donations go up slightly to suggest it's foolish that somebody donating $1,500, which is near the federal max now, is able to buy influence with that. It just doesn't happen. It forces the parties, and I think this is where we would all agree, to be able to make a pitch to voters that we're worth investing in. I would like to see parties make that pitch in a manner that is equal and across the board. That's of interest and good for democracy.
In Alberta, they stopped both the union donations and the business donations, but they didn't change the limit on the amount that people could donate. I'm looking at the registration. There was a big dinner here in Ontario last night in Toronto, the Heritage Dinner for the Liberal Party, and $18,000 for a table, victory table they call it.
Victory table. So what do they win?
Yeah.
I didn't ask that.
No, right. But I mean, those are pretty big sums. Your number one change, Chantal, what would it be?
I'm with Tim. I think it starts with banning corporate and union donations. I'm amazed that Alberta could do that within a couple of weeks, and Ontario's premier has been saying for a year that she's thinking about it. I think the ceiling on contribution needs to be brought down. I'm not saying $1,000 or $100 where it is here, but $15,000 as in Alberta is a bit of a mockery. But it does start with getting the big groups, the corporate and the unions, out of this business.
Well, maybe she wanted to get past the dinner last night before she makes those changes. Andrew, you're...
Well, I agree, obviously, with those suggestions. And I'll just add another one, which we haven't talked about, which is the so-called third-party spending. We've seen this outside the RIP period in federal politics. That's become an issue. And in Ontario politics, it's been a huge issue, although it hasn't been addressed. In elections, the last election, you had the so-called Working Families Coalition, basically a bunch of unions, spent $2.5 million. One organization, one election, spent $2.5 million basically attacking the Tories. And nobody has really addressed that. So we've got to somehow bring the third-party groups in under the same umbrella as the party, the avowedly partisan groups. I think they should all be treated on a level playing field in terms of how much you contribute to them. But that has to be addressed as well.
All right. Good discussion. It would be wrong if we left the segment this week without a comment from Chantal on her good friend Jean Lapierre.
Yes. And I found over the past 2 days that it's impossible to talk about Jean without having a smile on your face, because everyone who had contacts with him from parties, people he said terrible things about, couldn't help but having good things to say about how hardworking he was and how human he was. You know him more as someone who talks about Quebec, but in this province, he was a rare voice who talked about federal politics. And that voice will be missed. Even Twitter was good this week. And that tells you all you need to know about how we're going to miss that presence and the joy he brought to the business of talking about politics.
All right. Well, we'll leave it on that note. Tim, we thank you as well for joining us this week.
Thank you.